Okay, let me introduce the show.
Repeat. Okay, we're getting a repeat of our sound. So here's Bob. You sit here and talk to it. Do what you know. And,
Hi, this is Paula Gloria, and this show is called Rabbit Hole, Farther Down the Rabbit Hole, and we're streaming on Rabbit Hole Central, and I hope to be soon having on the line Professor Robert Ashford. Are you on the line with us, Robert?
I am on the line.
That's wonderful. I want to tell you that ever since I helped out to produce the show that you did with Harold, finally the penny dropped about binary economics, but I still have a lot of questions.
Okay.
One thing I'm wondering is when you talk about distributing capital ownership, everybody says, well, we have the stock market, so we all have a piece of the action that way. Can you explain that? Or am I leaping into it too quickly?
No, you're asking a good question. The hard part about talking is that we're getting an echo, so everything you say is heard twice.
Oh.
I have a feeling that if we have a call coming, just a minute.
Okay. Robert Ashford teaches...
Okay, I'm back.
Okay. Don't worry, while you're gone I can start singing your exalted praises about, you know, your long and splendid career. Robert?
Yes.
Okay.
Let me respond to your question about the stock market. Just a moment.
Okay.
Once you understand that capital does its own work and therefore earns its own income, and that the capital way of doing things is almost always, but not always, but almost always, more powerful than the labor way. So, for example, hauling sacks with a horse is much more powerful than hauling sacks personally.
Right.
Number crunching with a computer is much easier than number crunching personally. Digging with a steam shovel is much more powerful than digging with... Every task you can imagine is much more powerful with capital. Once you have to keep that firmly in mind, then the right that binary economics seeks to universalize is the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. Not with the earnings of labor,
Right.
but with the earnings of capital. Now, the Rockefellers and the DuPonts and the Gates and the Buffetts, they have no trouble because they're already in the market with a lot of capital, earning more capital with the earnings of capital. They're already in the game. But in order for poor and working people to get into the game in a significant way, they need to immediately access the full earning capacity of capital. So they need to be able, for example, to acquire a capital on credit, repay the loan with the full earnings of capital, and then after that process, begin earning an income from their ownership of machines, tools, structures, patents, trademarks, all the kinds of things that the rich already enjoy. So it's a process. And the difficulty with the stock market situation is, first of all, the only people who get in are either already in, or that there are that few number of people who, because of their earnings, and most people don't earn enough, they can get in through their labor earnings. But the first problem with the stock market is you can't get in big enough, fast enough for it to make anything more than a trickle. The second problem is that if you look at the returns that corporations pay on their earnings, most corporations, first of all, pay taxes. So the earning capacity of capital is already not going to go to paying off the debt used to acquire it. Secondly, most corporations retain their earnings for more reinvestment. That's how the Rockefellers and the DuPonts and all the rich people get to acquire capital with the earnings of capital.
Excuse me, Robert, you mean they retain their earnings and do not distribute to the shareholders? Is that what you're saying?
Retain the earnings and do not distribute to the shareholders.
Okay.
And remember, to enable a poor person to acquire capital with the earnings of capital when they don't start with any capital, the first round of payments have to go to retire the loan. they have to go to repay the debt that's incurred for acquisition. And then after that, after the capital is fully paid, that's when the stream of income for food, clothing, shelter, and all the other things that people need begins to come through. And that needs to be a full income. That needs to be a full payout, because if the new shareholders, the poor and working people, are going to participate in capital acquisition, two things need to be going on. First of all, they always have to be buying more capital on credit, paid for with the earnings of that new capital acquired, and the capital they have acquired and paid for has to be paying a full income to them, so that they are providing the consumer base to make more investment profitable. Both things have to be going on at once. And the regular stock market doesn't work in that way. And it's an example of how, once you understand that capital does more than make labor more productive, that it does its own work, it's important to understand that's how it changes the way we look at things. Let me just give you a particular example. The left wing says it's good to tax corporations so we can pay jobs, we can pay welfare to the poor. It's good to tax corporations. We don't want to tax those big bad corporations. And the people who are already rich say, fine, take some of our apples, but we still get to acquire all the new trees. If you tax the earnings of the corporate earnings of poor and working people, then that capital will not pay enough of a return to enable them to acquire it on credit. So actually, what is done in the name of socialist redistribution serves as a barrier to poor and working people being able to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. And that's the key, acquiring capital with the earnings of capital.
So Robert, would that be like communism coming along and sort of distracting everybody from what's really going on?
Well, what it is, you could look at it that way. That's that kind of response. To the extent that you start from the notion that it is good, it is an affirmative virtue to distribute the surplus of capital and labor, the work done by capital and labor, without distinguishing between them, through jobs and welfare. If that's a virtue, and if it's a bad thing to distribute any of the earnings, or much of the earnings of capital through labor, through capital. If the idea is that only rich own capital, we ought to minimize the capital return. If you start that as a virtue, then you'll never end up with poor and working people earning capital.
Right.
Because what you're doing is that you're taking so many apples away from the rich to support jobs and welfare that the rich keep on acquiring all the trees. Now, they may be acquiring trees at a slower rate that might exist if you broadened ownership. But so what? I mean, suppose if the rich are only acquiring 2 trees a year, whereas with broader ownership they may acquire 2, and the poor might acquire some too. They say, well, so what? As long as it's up to our advantage. It seems to me that the rich plutocratic capitalists love the extreme socialists because all they're doing is fighting over who gets the apples.
I understand, but I want to still elaborate because it's a real mind stretch. When you say capital makes labor more productive, or Adam Smith was saying capital makes labor more productive, nobody has ever questioned this. But in truth, as labor becomes less important for building up our wealth, and technology becomes more important for building up the wealth, then capital is actually making capital more productive.
Absolutely. The second you've got it right on the head. The first principle of binary economics is capital is independently productive. It does its own work. The second principle of binary economics is that technology makes capital much more productive than labor.
Right.
We can concede that capital may make labor more productive under certain circumstances. But what is also true, and even more true, is that capital always makes capital more productive than labor.
Now, Robert, I know that you're a professor and you're a scholarly man, and you probably haven't put much attention on politics, but we do have these, I can see, outmoded institutions and a lot of people that are beholden to them. How can we sort of develop the type of think tanks? Because I have a gut feeling that by having capital more productive in general, instead of what you talked about, moribund capital, how can we develop a platform whereby we show, and this is only my intuition so far, that even the DuPonts, even the Gates, even the people who have all the capital now will also be better off? Because it's an eyesore to have to go through ghettos and to see people who are homeless. And, you know, if the overall society starts to be more robust and productive, doesn't everybody gain, even the people at the top?
Well, I would say so, but you raised two or three wonderful points, and I want to compliment you that of the people who have interviewed me, you have more comprehension than almost anybody I've dealt with, so I want to compliment you. Let me just say, give an aside before I respond. I think concentrated ownership is a nuisance, in the very sense that having a blight or a dump next to you, or a cesspool that we can't afford to clean up, or slums, concentrated ownership is a big nuisance, and it would help if we dealt with that. But let me respond to your question in 2 or 3 different ways. First of all, and this is written very nicely in the book that I wrote with Rodney Shakespeare, Binary Economics, A New Paradigm. It doesn't appear anywhere else in the writings. The rich really are divided into 2 groups politically. One, and I think the majority, I won't say who's the majority and who's the minority, but they really divide into 2. There is a certain group of people and the rich that say, wonderful, if you could make capitalism work for everybody so that if our capital becomes more productive because there's a bigger demand and the poor people become too, then we legitimate private property for everybody. We solve the socialist problems in a capitalist means. We fortify the institutions of private property. We eliminate the blight and the nuisance. We don't have to have as many keys. We don't have to have any police. We don't have to have, that's wonderful. Let's do it. And I'd say but I think that's, at least in the past, it's been a minority. And then there's another group of people who are rich who say, no, you don't understand. The wonderful thing about capitalism is that there's so few of us. And if more people get rich, if there are more millionaires and more billionaires and more 100,000-aires, then the place on the lake, the haciendas, we're going to get too crowded. We like it this way. Besides that, if poor people begin to earn return from capital, they may begin demanding, more pay for less. Demanding more pay for what they do. They're going to be pickier. They're going to be able to enforce their own safety regulations. They're going to say, I'm not going to work next to this dangerous machine. You put a guard on it because I'm getting earning. So there's a sense in which some people on the right think the wonderful thing is the relative advantage of being rich and having people that are poor. And there are those that have suggested that there's a psychological dimension in that, which also points to why we have racism. It's important for some people to feel superior to others, one by way of the chosen race, one by way of the chosen sex, one by way of the wealth. So the right wing divides into 2. Now the interesting thing is that the left wing divides into 2 too. There are those, and some of the bitterest opponents of binary economics start from the moral premise, their moral premise, that it's an affirmative virtue, I mentioned this before, to distribute the earnings of capital and labor by way of jobs and welfare. And that it's immoral, they call them rentiers, to earn income from capital. We ought to minimize it as much as possible. But then there's another group on the left, and I suspect politically they're a majority, that say, I'm a little uncomfortable with redistribution. I know that we need to help the poor, and enlightened voters are even willing to vote more taxes on themselves to help the poor. I know that, but it is a forced redistribution. It is saying that, we majority think you people ought to give money to the poor, but there's no better way. And so that's why they're on the left. They're reluctant redistributionists. Now those people you can say, but there is a better way. There's the binary way. So you take the best of the left, and what I would call the best of the left, and the best of the right, or at least those 2 groups that, without making judgments, that have an interest. The rich that want open capitalism, the poor that are looking for an alternative to redistribution, and the left, and put those together. Now, so that's a way of introducing it into the political structure long term. Let me also answer one other thing for you, and that is, my own view is that lead in the economically disadvantaged areas. For example, if Jesse Jackson, just to pull up a name, or Obama, or some if black leaders, if the black leaders were really to look at binary economics and see it as something special, and begin adding capital acquisition with the earnings of capital to their discussions internally, then that would change the dimension of their discussions with the power structure. That has not happened, and that needs to happen. That's simply not something that's there. And one of the ways I explain this is by a little homily. Someone comes to your office and says, "Paula, I'm hungry. I haven't eaten in 2 days." Well, my goodness, a person like you would immediately get some foods into them, take them out to eat, and get some nourishment. Well, another person might come into your office and say, there's food in my refrigerator, but I just lost my job, or my income doesn't meet my expenses, and I can see myself out on the street in a few months or a few years. Well, you try to get them a better job. That's jobs and welfare. But what prevents the left from saying, in addition to those two things, our people need to be able to acquire capital with the earnings of capital? What prevents the left from saying, this has to be on the table too? The right wing is taking care of that for theirs. Why shouldn't the left do that too? So I think there's a logical process, but it starts with educating the leaders, and the problem is, of course, that most people think that there's no new idea. Most people are willing to say, well, listen, I've heard of this before. Well, we've had stock market before. There's nothing new in this. And most people in a position of leadership are unwilling to take the time it takes to learn the subject matter. That's the truth. They think they've known everything already.
Right. Well, there's a lot of attention that goes into the psychology of selling products, or the psychology of certain powerful people or institutions hiding what they're doing. But I don't think enough attention is going into the psychology, if you even use that word psychology, of opening our minds. And I think real education is not about filling you with facts, but wisdom is about this mechanism of how you open the mind, sometimes thought to be meditation or a spiritual practice, and other times I think thought to be what you're talking about. Why are people not seeing these things? Now, when I heard Louis Kelso, and first of all, regarding your compliment about how I'm asking you questions other interviewers haven't, I'm actually realized about a month after I really understood what binary economics was, that I'm a living example, and so is my brother, because we got involved in cellular telephone lotteries, which gave us a license to broadcast a cellular signal in 13 counties in Kentucky. And as a result, we took something that was just the cost of an application, and lawyers and engineers to make an application to give to the FCC and the application company. We got a license that sold for $20 million. And so I can see that we got a little hint of the enormous assets that are usually not distributed in this way. Wall Street Journal, Forbes magazine, everybody was preaching against it as long as the lotteries were opened. And as soon as the lotteries closed, they said, you lost an opportunity of a lifetime. So I'm beginning to realize that for whatever, we weren't really quite prepared for this amount of money, but we scrambled as best we could in this lifetime and went through, a lot of the learning curves. So I know firsthand that there are people who have a lot of capital who have no idea where to start. To go run out on the streets and help the homeless. They don't know where to start. And yet Louis Kelso sounded to me exactly like attorneys that we used to hire for the sole purpose of minimizing taxes. Except Louis Kelso, instead of having a few wealthy people as clients, it seemed as though he reached that spiritual maturity where he was thinking not about a few, but about the entire society. And that really touched me. It was like a quality of a saint.
He was the first corporate finance attorney for the people.
Yeah.
And I try to follow in his lead, but he was the first corporate finance attorney for the people.
Now, did
to know that.
Now, did you were talking about being part of the stock market not giving you the power of return that capital should really give you, and you said that they have to retire the debt. Now, Harold Channer called to my attention about capital purchasing itself on the basis of future earnings.
Yes.
Now, was Louis Kelso the man who, I'm describing the leverage buyout, is that correct?
That's right. That's exactly right.
Now, did he develop the leverage buyout?
The first ESOP was a leveraged buyout. It was a leveraged buyout for the employees. All binary economics, the starting point of all binary economics is acquiring capital with debt and then paying it off with the earnings of capital. So Kelso was the originator of that. He taught the people at KKR, who were leading leveraged buyout people, about the ESOP, and they quote improved it unquote by excluding the employees and just cutting in the managers and their own and the rich participants. They improved the concept of leveraged buyout, and I think they also gave it a very bad name and perverted it by making it an ownership concentrating phenomenon for the most part, rather than an ownership broadening.
Can you quickly go through the steps of ESOP? Because I'm not even aware. I thought that instead of paying them a raise, you give them some little meaningless amount of stock.
Well, that's right. The ESOP, there are two aphorisms that I oftentimes use to help give people the sense of what binary economics is all about. You probably have heard many people say it. The right wing says it a lot, sometimes the left. A rising tide raises all boats. You've probably heard that expression.
Right.
And the idea is that if you help the rich expand the economy, then the poor will do too. And then there's another kind of political aphorism or wisdom that says half a loaf is better than none. But I take those two, and I'm going to get to your question of the ESOP, but I put those two together and say, yes, a rising tide raises all boats, but you need a boat. The boat is capital. If without capital, a rising tide will just drown. You're just going to be swamped and drowned. And the other thing is, half a boat won't do. You need a whole boat. Now, the ESOP as it exists today is kind of a third of a boat. You've got the corporation. You need that because you won't find a rich man acquiring capital with the earnings of capital unless he has limited liability. Most corporate rich people, they may make some of the big decisions, but they quickly hire a trustee to do all the details, or some fiduciary. So you need the trust. If you're going to acquire capital efficiently, you want to maximize the debt you use. You want to borrow money at a low rate and invest it in something that earns at a higher rate, so you get the difference between the cost, the profitability of the capital and the cost of the money. So you need a lender. Now, investors, that's what we have with ESOPs. We have those three notions. So a lender can lend to an ESOP, a trust. The trust can invest in the stock of the company. The company can make the capital investment and then repay the trust, and the trust can repay the lender. But that's only about, I said it's about a third of a vote. Without collateral, the only reason to invest in the trust rather than to loan directly to the company, the only reason for the bank to loan to the trust instead of the company is that the existing shareholders have to be taking the risk of loss, and the existing shareholders have to be giving away a part of that acquisition even though they've suffered the risk. But if you have capital credit insurance, if you have an insurance policy that stands as a substitute for the equity investment of the shareholders, then there's an economic reason to give it all to the employees and the acquisition. And once you pay out the earnings of capital and it's paid for itself, and you now begin getting a consumption function down the line. That's what makes the capital more profitable. That function doesn't exist with ESOPs. So all ESOPs are today is still acquiring capital basically with the earnings of labor. Instead of giving them some cash,
right?
You give them. But so the ESOP does not give people, in the initial instance, the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. It's simply a deferred compensation device.
Now,
buying capital with the earnings of labor is not competitive with buying capital with the earnings. It's like trying to compete with a horse for hauling. You simply can't do it.
no, again, I look on my cellular experience, because you know what determines somebody's qualifications to enter the lottery? U.S. citizenship. That was it, and demonstration of financial capability and an engineering report that was solid. So I don't know if you've looked at the Wikipedia definition of binary economics, but it still sounds like a type of handout. It says that you give out loans. So there's that gut feeling that you're giving away something that otherwise whoever owns it right now would be would benefit by holding on to.
Well, I want to say just one thing about the Wikipedia notion. It was called to my attention many months ago. And I saw something on there that I found to be very misleading in many ways. And I actually did enter in my own description of binary economics. And I think it stayed up there for a few days, and then somebody else amended it. So if you were going to history, you actually find one that I did. But I have little hope at this point that Wikipedia, because of its commitment to democratic participation, is going to come up with a good definition of binary economics. There is an encyclopedia, it's the Sage Encyclopedia of Law and Society, where I did write a definition of binary economics, and that is something that is useful. I don't know if it's online, but there is that. And if one were to go to a website called SSRN, so I'm going to say SamRogerNow.com, and type in my name, you would see an overview of binary economics. Many people have done two things. First of all, some of them misconceive binary economics as being something other than it is. For example, those that say it's the same thing as the stock market.
Right.
Many people add to binary economics principles that are not essential. And many people use it in political ways that reflect particular agendas.
Right.
And that is simply because the idea, although it was first advanced by Kelso some 50-some years ago, 1957, it hasn't received a lot of widespread, rigorous attention. So there's a little bit of a free-for-all here at this point. We have not yet, even among the people who support it, there's not yet a full and cogent understanding of what it is. I do think that the difference between my work and the work of most other people is that and it's also the difference between my work and Louis Kelso's work, is that I focus on only those aspects of binary economics that are totally new. For example, if you were to read The Capitalist Manifesto, which was Kelso's first book.
In 1975, right?
1957.
Oh, 57.
57.
Wow.
The first book on the subject. You would find out that the idea of what I call binary growth, the distributive relationship between capital acquisition, broader capital acquisition, and growth, is hardly mentioned in that whole book. And that's the book that he's most known for. Now, if you were, and even in his later books like Two-Factor Theory and Democracy and Economic Power, you would find out that what he does, and I love his work, but he advances many reasons for broader ownership. And the psychology of people is this: if you have 7 reasons for broader ownership, 6 of which are old and have been advanced before, and 1 of which is new and controversial, and you're a reader of this, and you believe in broader ownership, and you're going to repeat what you've read, you're going to emphasize the 6 things that are uncontroversial and been said before, and you're going to miss the one introduce a concept. Some people do it consciously, but most people, I think, just miss it. They miss it unconsciously.
Well, no, you know, Robert, I think controversy is our biggest hope for progress, but it takes a certain stamina to be able to withstand disapproval, because that's why it's controversial.
It's one of the barriers. And so what distinguishes my work from really almost all the other work in this area is that I only emphasize those things which are new. There are people, for example, who believe that binary economics, the strongest arguments for binary economics are moral arguments. That is to say, it is moral to enable poor and working people to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. It's a wonderful thing to do. It's moral, and anybody who doesn't want to do that is... Now, the truth of the matter is, that doesn't distinguish... The moral reason for helping the poor doesn't distinguish this idea from all sorts of forms of redistribution, socialism, Robinhoodism, all sorts of other things. So you will not find in my writing the proposition that broader ownership is good, in the sense that it's something we morally ought to do. What you will find is that broader ownership will promote growth. You can hate that. You could be the King of England and want to own everything, and still begrudgingly admit, kicking and screaming, that yes, broader ownership promotes growth. So those people that insist that you agree with the moral proposition of binary, they may think they're doing good, but I think it confuses what is new about it.
Okay, so we're back to what I was thinking again, which is that I think that the people who understand binary economics the best are actually the ones who are suppressing it the most, because they don't understand it fully, that it will also be in their interest, and which case I want to get back to emphasizing the importance of staying in connection with people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so you've got to walk the line of controversy, but at the same time not be so controversial that people disconnect, because we're in a crisis right now with the economy.
Well, I think we have to help recognize, and I think I agree with you, what you say. I think we have to realize that the most important thing is to enhance people's understanding. And you can confuse people, number one, by adding ideas which may be in harmony with binary economics, but are not essential to understanding it. You can also, and I think the people that do that have a full understanding of its principles. They simply think that you have to link the moral arguments with it. I think it confuses the situation. That I can't judge, you know. But there are other elements. Let me just give you an example of another element. Binary economics, because of we haven't talked about this, but because of the way the full proposal is structured, really means that you do not need to charge interest for binary acquisition. You can exclude interest payment. You do pay the banker's spread for the service of finding a good loan, doing up the paperwork, protecting it with legal documents, enforcing it, making sure it's monitored, and collecting on it. That's a service charge which banks are entitled to get. You do have the insurance function of an insurance company insuring the risk of failure. That's not technically interest. Interest technically is renting other people's money. It's just a pure rental. It's separate from the risk, and it's separate from the service. And when you look at the structure of binary economics, you find out that the binary loans, there's no payment of renting other people's money, because we don't need other people's money to enable people to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. So that's a principle. Now, here's my point with that. That is very attractive to the people that believe that as Muhammad believes, that interest is a sin. You shouldn't charge interest, because that means that an economy built on Sharia can actually implement binary broadening ownership without charging interest. That's positive. That's very important. But it is not true that binary economics opposes interest. It is not true that an economy must outlaw interest in order to be faithful to binary economics. That's not true. That may be true of people who find binary economics attractive and want to implement it, but it is not true that to be a binary economist you must oppose interest. That's an entirely separate proposition. And there are those people who understand binary economics, who maintain that the true thing binary economics is that it eliminates interest. It does not eliminate interest. It provides a way for people to acquire capital with the earnings of capital without using interest. It does not eliminate interest.
I think again, you know, you have this rigid mindset that the only way you can make money from capital, which is a dormant thing, is through interest. But I think binary economics, as I'm understanding it, has a more dynamic understanding of capital, yes, which as so far seems to be untapped because of this stratification of the very rich and the masses.
To be sure, but it's one thing to say we will have an economy in which we will let people acquire capital with the earnings of capital without resort to interest, but other people can still engage in interest transactions. And another kind of economy says we will only let people engage in binary finance. Now those are two different political decisions.
Right.
And what's important for people to understand is that capital, the broader acquisition of capital with the earnings of capital, will promote growth, whether you're in the first kind of economy that lets both things go on, or whether you're in the second kind of economy that only lets one of them go on. The principle is true either way.
Right.
And that's what I'm teaching.
What do you think is the most important aspect that can be implemented the quickest and will ruffle the fewest feathers?
I think the proposal that I frequently advanced, and it's in this overview of binary economics at ssrn.com. It's in my book with Rodney Shakespeare, Binary Economics, The New Paradigm. It's in all my writings. Anybody who Googles me will find these writings. I think the simplest one to understand is what you might call the top-on-down model. It allows corporations to expand their ownership with ESOP-like vehicles. They already exist today, but include not only employees, consumers, neighbors, people who live around their plants and facilities, and even welfare recipients. It allows corporations which already have capital acquisition plans, which are bankable, which are lended with loan on. It allows to broaden it in this way. It creates an insurance regulatory structure that allows for the selling of capital credit insurance. Sets up an agency like the FHA, because we had good experience with the FHA and home loans, and authorizes the central bank monetization. These proposals that I have, and then simply authorizes these transactions, but lets the market decide whether they want to do it or not. I think that, but I will say that you can't, just like you can't have half a vote. You do need to do this thing right. You need all parts of that. You need the corporation that is able to broaden its ownership. You need the trusts that are able to act for employees, consumers, others. You need lenders that are able to make these kinds of loans. You need capital credit insurance, private and probably public reinsurance, and you need the relationship with the central. You do need the whole boat, in other words. And my own view is that we're not going to be able to implement it until it's more widely understood.
It seems to me that you need to get people from both sides to exert themselves to study, because there's a misunderstanding.
Yeah.
For example, you're going to be going to this conference with a lot of lawyers. I would ask you to keep an eye on Google and YouTube, because I think these new technologies are almost begging for a revolutionary and radical outlook, which is what this is. It's radical to the left and to the right, and yet it seems to resolve what both the left and the right are seeking: a unity of the society to come together and function more powerfully. Now, say for example with Wikipedia, do you think that these new definitions that keep coming in, which is the hope of a democratic, true and honest understanding, sort of erodes away the importance of a platform of authority that a person with limited time can trust to go to?
I think I lost the thrust of your question. You're going to have to try.
Well, you see, on one hand, you as a professor have a platform of respect and authority that you deserve yourself, and also that you inherited or you earned through your studies, at Harvard and so on. So other common people don't know what you know, nor do they have the platform that you have. Yet, it seems like for myself, I seek out the best authority that I can, and then I test it on the masses. So YouTube, by putting something up for commentary, becomes an opportunity where the intelligence of an idea will sort of rise up. So Kelso, why would Kelso trust the masses? Why would he want to be an attorney for the masses? Maybe we could get what I'm seeking that way.
He believed that when people come to understand this idea, they would demand it. And he did believe in the final analysis, although he worked with the highest level, at the highest levels of society, he presented this to Ronald Reagan personally, presented this to Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, on hearing this, said, I could sell this idea to the American people in 6 months. But he did not.
Right.
And Reagan said he was supporting this idea, but he did not.
What about Russell Long?
Well, Russell Long again helped get the ESOP going, but I'm not a big fan of ESOPs. I consider ESOPs a half a vote.
Right.
You represent a client, and the client says, "Should I get involved in this transaction?" And my thing is, you're asking me, should you get involved in a capital acquisition transaction with your capital acquisition rights on the level of human hauling, and you're competing with people who have horses to haul? No, don't get involved in that transaction.
Exactly.
I think it's questionable. So Russell Long didn't, I don't think, get the big picture. He may not have had the power. He didn't get.
And how about William Simon, who was the head of the Department of the Treasury?
Well, I don't know what Simon understood about this idea, and as I say, I just don't know. I understand at some point that with Congressman Kemp, who is also that he's had some understanding. I am always skeptical when people say they understand binary economics, because once one really understands it, you can see it immediately, and they change their behavior. There's a fellow that you may have interviewed, an anthropologist named Sidney Greenfield, and he's a colleague of Harold, and he was exposed to the idea, and he listened to it, and a year later he came back and said, "Hey, this really," and it makes a difference. You can see it in his thinking.
Right.
If William Simon understood binary economics, then you would hear him saying, the solution we need is to enable people to acquire capital with the earnings of capital.
Right.
And I would say to your listeners that anytime somebody talks about a fuzzy ownership solution, they want to defend themselves, say, well, no, wait a minute now, are you talking about acquiring capital with the earnings of capital some other way?
But hang on, Robert, you get to this question of deservability. Who deserves what and why? Abraham went and sacrificed his son. He fully intended to kill his son because he wanted a connection with God. What skin does one put in the game, right? How do you, like my cellular license was determined by being a U.S. citizen.
Right. Well,
how do you determine it?
There are two or three different levels of answers to your question. First of all, if a binary economy were established, meaning to say the infrastructure were established to enable people voluntarily to engage in these kinds of ownership broadening transactions, if that were to happen, and you give it the advantage of Federal Reserve monetization, which is an advantage, then immediately the question becomes, if we're going to create a benefit, the Congress and the President, the political process is going to have to decide who goes first, who goes second, who goes third. That's a political question. And I could see it in different ways. It can be resolved in different ways. A very good binary economist up in Syracuse suggested, I think it should be per capita. Everybody should be able to participate, not in proportion to compensation, not in proportion to need, just per capita. Everybody should be able to participate in this way. Other people say there ought to be a need notion. You start with the poorest people. That will happen. So on one level, if it is implemented, there will be political decisions. There's another level of the answer to your question, and this has to do with my proposition of that this is a positive factual proposition. If you want to grow the economy and fully develop the profitability of the technology that we have today, you must broaden ownership. You got to do it because concentrated ownership strangles the earning capacity of capital and suppresses growth. So you got to figure out stuff. So it's not a matter of people deserving it. It's a matter of if you want to have a rational economy where people don't feel obligated to steal and to shirk and to do other dishonest things or to grab things or to feel like they've got to be greedy because they don't have enough. If you want to change a society that doesn't have the nuisance that we have today, you've got to let people know whether they deserve. I mean, now you can say that every person deserves dignity, and you can say the right to life is the right to earn a living, and in a capitalist society, that means the right to earn a living. You can give issues of desert, but they're really, in a sense, and they're political decisions that will be decided. But the truth of the matter is that what do people inherit millions of dollars today? What have they done to deserve acquiring capital with their earnings of capital? All they were is they happened to be in the right end of a conception between two wealthy people rather than two poor people.
Say, Robert, do you see yourself as a professor of law or economy?
My training in economics is aside from one graduate course in micro and macroeconomics, which I got an A in, I'm a law professor. I see myself as somebody that a law professor that concentrates on economic issues, finance issues, and law has an important component. Justice is an important component of law, and this system seems to be the system that will best actualize, or at least expand, our ways of achieving justice. So I guess I consider myself a law teacher.
I don't mean to throw a trick question at you. It's just that at one time the study of law was the study of religion and philosophy. They were the same study.
Well, I agree with that. At one time, all these things were one big field, weren't they?
Right.
And so, I mean, I think we have certainly over-credentialized economics as a profession. Adam Smith was not an economist. In fact, he was a social economist. John Maynard Keynes was a mathematician. And so there's that. Now, I have people who actually teach binary economics. I've gotten people in the law schools to teach binary economics. I try to get them to come to my programs to speak on it, and they say, well, I feel I can teach it because I can get in front of the student and say, this is an idea, but I'm not an economist, so I can't advocate it. And I say to them, I have never heard a lawyer say, I'm not a doctor. I mean, he's doing doctors all the time. I've never heard a lawyer say, well, I'm not an engineer if you sue somebody, a building collapses. I mean, lawyers are involved in doing all sorts of things that challenge the expertise of other disciplines. That's what it means to be a lawyer, to be able to step into it. And if you don't know enough about it, you get an expert to talk about it. But I guess if I had $1 for every time some law teacher who believes it personally but won't advocate it publicly, if I had $1 for every time I heard that, well, I'm not an economist.
But why do they do that, Robert? Is it because institutions are strictest about peer review on economy?
Well, I just wish I knew the full answer to that question. I do know that in most, I do know that there is just kind of this question raises the study of taboos. The distribution of ownership is simply a very tabooish kind of subject.
Wow.
I cannot go to a foundation to, for example, get some funding to do socioeconomics and binary economics. I cannot go to a foundation and say, I'm interested in a broader distribution of ownership without being seen as a left-winger, as a socialist.
Yeah, but there's institutions for left-wingers and socialists too, but I think they're throwing people off the track, that's why. And I also think these so-called vested interests, you know, what is the vested? And according to my studies, I think some very wealthy people may be very uninformed. And if they were better informed...
It's a mixture of ignorance, I think some people who are very rich and in a good position believe that the problem with binary economics is it helps poor people get rich. I mean, I do think that there are some that do see the principles and don't believe they better not advocate it. I am in contact with professors at Ivy League schools who won't return my phone calls, and who say that they're for poor and working people and have made their careers on that. Now, I believe that those people basically have received the message from somewhere else that you shall not touch this idea. You can look at the history of this idea, and you can see, name probably doesn't, maybe you not recall, but there was a man named Nicholas von Hoffman, who was a highly syndicated columnist in the 70s and 80s, who began writing about binary economics. And the story I have is that he was told by the people who were responsible for syndicating his columns, is that you have to stop writing about Louis Kelso. They just told me you just have to stop doing that. Now my guess is that some of those people understood the implications. Would you rather, if you were rich and stingy and wanted it all for yourself, wouldn't you want the debate to be how many apples are we going to give to the poor rather than...
But you know what I'm going to counter to that? I think that at a certain point, the masses have to wake up themselves, and they have to demand it.
Well, I think that's
because you can't be leaning on this media. I mean, I have exerted myself for the past 2 years to study the 9/11 issue, and I've had different levels of understanding that it's an inside job, and so on. But now, my final conclusion is 9/11 is a media job. In which case, this fellow who's syndicating his column and his editors aren't allowing him, or they get the word from on high, I think people have to wake up and look at how they're spending their time and what they're reading and why they're reading it. YouTube, one thing I like about it is people can answer you back. And I find that 95% of the time, if I just answer people, even if I'm upset at them because they're not believing what I felt I did such a good job to convince them of, I realize if I stay in connection with them, more often than not, it's just a function of ignorance. And sometimes I'm the ignorant one. But if we can stay in connection, we can keep developing a more profound body of knowledge, and we can advance. But I become concerned when I hear that YouTube takes certain sites down. Now maybe I wish that those sites had more communication skills, not to make a bad guy out of anybody, but to keep them in the loop constantly. But still, I worry when I think that knowledge and data is being withheld from me, and I'm thinking that binary economics really becomes imperative when it comes to something like YouTube, because it's not only the capital involved with YouTube, but it's your labor, and the labor of people who've commented on you.
I think that's right. Okay, but before Harold is asking me to give him the phone.
Okay.
I just wanted to check, are you taping this, dear?
Yes, I am, and I'll post it, and I know we're running...
And I'm wondering if you're going to put it on MNN or on the air.
Yes, I am. But I think...
Are you coming to the end of an hour on the tape, and do you...
Probably. Let me check it.
That technical stuff, Donna, look it up and see if it fits into the scheduling and what the time is. It's really good, Bob, really good.
No, we have 5 more minutes.
You have 5 minutes. I'll give you back to Bob. It's really great. Let's see if you can get it on the air and get it out.
Okay, I definitely will.
Here, talk.
Say, Bob?
Yes. Let me say in response to your proposition, I think it is important for the people to know. The people have a right to know, and approaching this on all levels of society needs to be done, and there's no substitution for every level of society. And so I'm in total agreement with you. I do think there is a value in looking for certain institutional opportunities that allow us to speak to more economically than many people. Just as an example, in New York City, you're from New York City, there is, I'm sure, an interreligious council of faiths dedicated to helping poor and working people. Why hasn't that organization heard about this idea? I mean, this is an example, and to me it's a mystery, but it's there. And I do think that if that interreligious council were to listen to this idea and spend 3 or 4 or 5 hours thinking of it, and let's say there are 30 people on that council, I'm convinced that 10 or 15 of them would get it.
Right.
And they would be able to speak to people, and that would both trickle down and trickle up.
I'm glad you bring that up, because I have a man in mind, Frank Morales at the St. Mark's Church. I'm very impressed with the decisions that he's made, and I've always been maybe overly anxious to have a seminar about Jesus in India. But I think he might be just the man for the job, because there's also another man in the 9/11 Truth movement that I'm impressed with. His name is Kevin Barrett, and he teaches Arabic. He's a Westerner who became a Muslim, but he has that quality of the Quran, and he talks about conviviality. And that's something, I read the Quran in a Tibetan refugee camp in India, because I spent 4 years there covering the bases. And the Quran has this quality of beauty and harmony to it. And this is what attracts me to binary economics. It's harmonious to have everybody in society connected.
Yes, it is. And there's, by the way, on the web, a article that I wrote on Christianity. It's called "Using Christian Principles to Enhance Economic Theory," and I argue that in that article that if you take Christianity to be simply the words of Jesus, so we have a limited definition. It's not the Father's teaching. It's not all the things in the New Testament. It's not the epistles. It's just the red. Sometimes Bibles have the red words. If you make yourself a red word Christian and read the words of Jesus, what he says, what he stands for, and you look at right-wing economic theory, you look at left-wing economic theory, you look at mixed economic theory of the left and the right, you look at the Keynesians, you look at all that, and then you look at binary economics. Binary economics is clearly the most consistent theory according to Jesus. And we could expound on that, but just as an example, Jesus says the sun shines and the rain falls on the good and bad alike, that when he broke the bread and included everybody, there was more, not less. The whole principle about the idea that all good comes from God and that we are responsible for the rest. Capital ownership is that's the laws of nature. Capital ownership follows God laws. It's human free will that gets things screwed up, and the human free will can result in good only when it's consistent with God's approach. And loving inclusion is the principle of binary economics. Exclusion is the principle of plutocratic trickle-down capitalism, and also the other element is that private property is what liberates people.
Right.
And so again, that's a part of what it is to be a human being.
You're getting into some of my very favorite topics, but I don't want to launch in on that right now. But I do want to say that I think we should move forward with this feeling of looking at all the resources, and I'd like to see you have a greater presence on the internet. And at the same time, I'm going to make some efforts to start looking into what exactly is going on with the ownership of the internet. And I feel fortified by this wonderful opportunity to have a cable daily show in Manhattan, because the people are very savvy there, to get some feedback. And also, Harold Channer and I are not so much linear people. So I think the Bible has a value, but I like to know not what Jesus said, but I want to see some demonstration in the here and now. And I have tried to explain to Harold that I feel that scarcity has always been transcended, not only with the multiplying of the loaves, but that if Jesus came as a man and had to go through everything that human beings go through, he would certainly have to exert himself in a course of studies. And I find that there's a huge body of knowledge in India, and I'm sure all over the world, but that's one where it's very prevalent, that you have books like the Vedas, but there's another dimension that goes in a non-linear way, and that's what I'm very excited to explore in the future, to see if we can bring people together on all levels, on the internet, also physically. So I'm going to go to Frank Morales and see if perhaps binary economics might be what I was seeking for in this idea of Jesus having studied in India.
Well, I'm all in favor of anything you do. You really have been, you've been very, 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 very good in terms of giving this publicity.
Well, it's the least I can do to give back, because, like I say, because of a fluke of circumstances, I'm an example of capital distribution in this cellular licensing, and it's kind of like a blessing that I never realized I had. You know, I mean, obviously the money, $5 million, is great, and then I lost it in other things because people were saying to me, Paula, it doesn't always come that way. But I'm really glad that it came the way it did, and I'm so grateful for the people who are around me now, people like yourself, that we can have this kind of discussion, and also with Harold and with Joe Friendly, to see if we can maximize what a Manhattan neighborhood network cable access channel going through the physical ground of Manhattan and then through the airwaves throughout the world. I think there is a mechanism to it, and content is king. Oh, and finally, I want to say, I'm not against willpower, Robert. I think we need a lot of willpower right now to keep moving forward with this idea.